Good afternoon, everyone. As Dr. Tolan said, our guest today is Dr. David Smith, one of the co-editors of our book, Teaching in Christian Practices, Reshaping Faith and Learning. His co-editor, Dr. Jamie Smith, a guest here before on our campus, is professor of philosophy. Dr. David Smith is the director of the Kyers Institute at Calvin for the teaching Christian teaching and learning. He's professor of German. In addition, he serves as the editor of the Journal of Education and Christian Belief and is former editor of another journal, the Journal of Christianity and Foreign Languages. His most recent book is Learning from the Stranger, Christian Faith and Cultural Diversity. In soon to come, I believe, he will be the director of graduate studies in education at Calvin. So welcome, Dr. Smith.
Thank you.
In the introductory chapter of the book, and I don't know if this is you or Jamie Smith's language of game changer, but you talk about calling for a game change in the way that we talk about what it means to educate Christianly. Can you talk a little bit about what the old game was and what needs changed?
Yeah, I think the old game we had in mind there was the generation that's grown up over the last sort of 30, 40 years of discussions of Christian higher education came out of a particular anxiety, which was that Christians had not participated fully as Christians in the academy, in the life of the mind, in terms of theory construction, in terms of ideas, in terms of engagement with the contents of the academy, that Christians had tended to be, warm hearts and empty heads is of course, the stereotype, right? That you have chapel meetings, you pray, you go on mission trips, and so on, but you're pretty clueless about the ideas that are actually shaping the disciplines and shaping society, and so on. Coupled with a cultural realization as modernity was giving way to some other things that ideas come from somewhere, right? That you can look at theories in any discipline and say, they're weighted, they're ideological. There's the way we think about the world gets influenced by our basic stances, our worldviews. So it's legitimate to say that you can think Christianly about the world, that you can have a Christian understanding of literature, you can have a Christian view of science, you can have a Christian view of various things. And so that generated a literature which pushed very hard for the development of a Christian mind. To say we need to learn to think Christianly across the disciplines. We need to learn to take our Christian identity seriously when we do hard thinking about how the world works, whatever area of the curriculum we're working in, not just in theology, but in all of the other areas. And that's shaped a whole literature that's come out of that. But what somehow got lost along the way in that conversation is the fact that thinking, when you're looking at colleges and universities, takes place in classrooms with bodies, with people. And that another variable in here, another thing that's affecting what's going on is how we interact with each other, how we teach and learn in these kinds of settings. That it's not enough just to talk about whether the ideas are Christian, but so imagine this conversation I had with 3 students at Calvin College in the last month, all of whom have been in a particular religion class, first year compulsory core religion class. And composite of the 3 conversations, what they told me about that class was that the chairs were in fixed rows facing the front the entire time, that the professor stood behind a lectern the entire time and made almost no eye contact with the class, that the atmosphere was somewhat intimidating, that the lecture began the moment the class started and finished the moment the class finished, and there was no chance for questions or interaction. And as one of the students said, 2 or 3 weeks into the class, we kind of gave up trying to engage with the class because clearly there wasn't going to be room to engage. Now, it may be that the intellectual content of this class was brilliant for all I know. I mean, I had no idea exactly what was being handled, but it might be deeply Christian, thoroughly defensible, carefully thought through theology that's being taught in the class. But that's not the only thing that's being learned in that class. The other thing that's being learned in that class is that religion is authoritarian, non-participatory, intimidating, etc. And I mean, that's obviously a particularly bad example, but in all kinds of other subtle ways, part of what is learned in a classroom comes out of the practices that we engage in together, not just about the content that's being taught. So I think part of what we wanted to signal with the game-changing thing was saying, Academics are sometimes the worst at thinking through the practices in which they're engaged. Elementary school teachers are much better at this, about knowing that it makes a difference if you sit down together on the carpet rather than standing up and these kinds of things. But academics are often very focused on their ideas, and we want to talk about our ideas. So the question we're raising is, does Christian higher education just mean that you still have someone standing at the front talking to people, but now you just talk about Christian things? Or are there ways we need to look at reconstructing the practices we engage in together so that they're more consistent with Christian ideals for formation?
So what is the point of a class at a Christian university, a Christian college, in history? Is it not to learn to think Christianly about history, to learn to think in through a paradigm or a lens of a Christian worldview about economics, about biology? Isn't that the goal?
Yes, it is. But one of the interesting facts about teaching is that when you're teaching, you're never pursuing just one goal, at least not if you're paying attention. So when I walk into a foreign language class, I've taught German, French, and Russian at different times. Okay, part of my goal is to teach you German verbs and to get that to work. But I also need to be paying attention to your emotional security in the class, because if you're feeling really threatened by having to speak in a strange language in front of other people, then chances are you're not going to take risks, you're not going to speak aloud, you're not going to answer questions. That means you're not going to get enough practice, and so you're not going to come out speaking the language, you're going to come out with lots of notes. So I've also got to attend to that. If I teach you the verbs without looking at culture, how does your American cultural formation make it difficult for you to interact with Germans? And when you actually communicate with people, you might end up getting the grammar right, but the interaction wrong. I'm going to be interested in whether you're prejudiced against foreigners and what that has to do with how you run at learning other languages and how that comes out of your cultural formation. I'm going to be interested in whether you listen respectfully to other people in class when they say things, because that's part of an ethic of how we interact with each other. And if I'm a teacher, I've got to be interested in all of those things. Right? I can't pass off the rest of the list and just say, well, my job here is I'm interested in German verbs. Not without shirking my responsibility, because as the teacher, I'm the person who gets to do a lot of shaping of what happens in the classroom. So I think it's a normal part of the act of teaching that you're pursuing 6 goals, 10 goals, 15 goals simultaneously. So certainly you're learning to think Christianly about history. But I think you're smuggling into that statement some assumptions about how you might go about learning to think Christianly about history as well, that's best going to happen by standing talking about it.
So how are we formed? This idea that it's not just the information, it's the formation that we're after. And what are these Christian practices? Are these historic Christian disciplines taken from a monastery and moved into an academic environment? What do you mean by practices?
I hear 3 questions
Okay.
in there. How are we formed? I'll address that very briefly and then try to do it inductively as we go along. How are we formed? We're formed in a whole bunch of ways. I mean, formation's complicated. I mean, if you think of how did you end up the person you are right now, the answer to that is not simple or one sentence. But certainly one of the ways we're formed is by doing things together over time. You're formed by the patterns of your life, right? The things that happen repeatedly, the things that you do together with other people, the grooves that you gradually get guided into, the ways you get used to doing things. So you're formed by participating in practices. So I'm assuming that during the next, however long we're here, the next 45 minutes, that none of you are going to leap up out of your seat, run to the front, jump up on the stage, burst into tears, do a little dance of joy and hug me. And that's probably not because anybody gave you a piece of paper on the way in that said, beware, the speaker today is British, you shouldn't hug him. It's more because you've been through a cultural formation in which you know what's supposed to happen in lecture sessions. Right? You know that in lectures you're supposed to sit there and try to look intelligent and nod wisely, and give an encouraging smile every now and then, appear to be taking notes. Right? This kind of there's a set of behaviors that you've learned that go together with that have formed your expectations of what it means to take place in this kind of exchange. If this were a certain kind of TV game show, and I called your name, then you might run screaming down to the front and jump up onto the stage and do a little dance and hug me, and you would accept that as being normal for that environment because, again, you've seen other TV shows. This is a repeated part of your experience. So, again, sort of interesting. You get formed by taking part in things, by imbibing the unspoken assumptions that shape the way we do things together. You learn the moves. What was the other question?
What are these Christian
the
practices?
practices, the disciplines,
Are
right?
these spiritual disciplines?
Yeah, they might be. So let me take two examples, two very different examples that would run at this from different angles, one of which is more like a spiritual discipline and the other of which isn't. So start with the spiritual discipline one. A colleague of mine recently who teaches economics got very exercised, was having one of these, faculty lounge moans about life today and students and teaching and so on. And his concern was that certainly on Calvin's campus, I know that it'll be very different and much more godly here, but on Calvin's campus, probably students and faculty really don't take the notion of Sabbath very seriously. We're pretty much 24/7 in terms of working, writing papers, doing jobs, scurrying around our social lives, etc. There are very few pauses during the semester for reflection. Sunday afternoon, you're just as likely to be writing a paper as Thursday afternoon. Now, whatever you think about Sabbath, whatever your theology of Sabbath is, let's just assume for a moment that's a legitimate concern. What are his options for running at that? Well, again, in terms of the game-changing question, right? He could decide to do a series of devotions about the Sabbath in class, and he could hand out readings about the Sabbath, about the theology of Sabbath, and we could have class discussions about Sabbath. He could give a carefully crafted lecture about why the rhythms of Sabbath might be important to healthful living in the modern world. And that would be sort of our classic way of going at this. We would treat the Sabbath as an idea, and we would discuss it together. And then we would go on not doing anything about the Sabbath, except we would now know that the Sabbath was important. And or he could do what he did. And the first step was he actually sat down and looked at his semester, and he systematically redesigned his course so that it was not possible to work on Sunday for his course. Now, the way he did that was very simple. He made sure that every assignment was due by Saturday evening, electronically, with heavy penalties for turning it in late. And then the next assignment was not posted until Monday morning, so it was never possible to know what you had to do for the course on a Sunday, which meant it was not possible to work for this course on a Sunday unless you were just making up work, which, of course, everybody does, right, is make up extra assignments for the... So... Now, so far, this is not maybe quite practices yet because this is just changing behavior, and that, just taking a day off is not Sabbath yet. So maybe he also talks about Sabbath, and we do the idea thing as well. So it's not about getting away from talking about ideas. It's about embedding the ideas in patterns and rhythms of life. So what he's done is he's reconstructed his teaching around a Christian practice, which is the practice of taking Sabbath. So that's an example that is like a classical spiritual discipline and somebody sitting down and thinking, maybe this actually tells us something about how we ought to live together as teachers and learners, right? About what ought to happen in classrooms. But take an example that's not a traditional spiritual discipline. I had a long email from a student of mine after he graduated, and he went on to a well-known seminary. You would recognize it if you named it, but since I'm going to tell a bad story about it, I'm not going to name it. In the email, he said, I'm in a class on Anglo-American postmodernity, and in this class, I've been started to be distressed by the way the assignments are designed. So the first assignment that we all got back, many of the students who I think are the best students in the class, they're thoughtful, they ask great questions, they're the kind of people I'd want to sit and debate the issues with. I'd want them to look at my paper and see if they could improve it. They all got pretty mediocre grades on this first assignment, whereas some of the people I actually thought were kind of weaker in class, they seemed to do pretty well. And so a bunch of us sat down and started comparing our assignments and what the professor had written on the assignments. And we came to the conclusion that what the professor wanted was actually a boatload of citations and conformist answers to the questions. In other words, we were supposed to repeat what the professor said on the lectures and then put at least 40 citations at the end of the paper, and that would get you a really good grade. Whereas if you went off and actually tried to think it through and, tried to create your own argument and so on, that didn't do so well. And he said, this has happened to me in a few classes now, and what it does is it incentivizes apathy. Because the quickest path to success is just doing as you're told and putting the right things down on the page and getting a good grade. He says, I'm starting to worry that I'm not going to get through seminary with a shred of intellectual rigor left in me. Let's just stop and translate that for a moment. What he's saying to me is that the structure of the learning practices in his seminary course are teaching him that intellectual rigor and theological learning don't go well together. Right? You can't be smart and Christian, to put it in blunt terms. Right? If you're learning theology, that's about conformity. It's about putting the right answers on the page. It's about not thinking. Now, I think if the professor saw that email, he'd be kind of horrified. I really don't think that was his goal. Again, I also think the class may have had lots of great content. I'm guessing this professor has read a ton of books about Anglo-American postmodernity and so on. But again, some of the formative impulses that are coming through the learning practices, I also think if you ask most professors, whereabouts are you doing spiritual formation? Right? Where is faith formation happening in your university? That grading practices would not come high on the list of answers. Right? That faith formation, that's chapel services, right, or religion classes, or and so on, not how you grade the papers. And yet again, part of what this student is taking away from the grading of the papers is, when I write theology essays, I'm not supposed to think. So that would be an example of coming at it from the other end and saying, what are the practices we're already engaged in educators, and are they actually pushing us in directions we want to go in if we stop and question them and stop and ask what they're doing to us, rather than just accepting that this is what colleges do and therefore this is the way to go. So I think you can run at this multiple ways. You can run from classic Christian practices and say, do they teach us anything about the learning environment? Or you can start unpicking the practices of the learning environment and saying, is there anything in here that doesn't seem to be healthy Christian formation?
If one of my colleagues leaves and says, okay, I picked up some good techniques to use now in my class to add another dimension, maybe that's been neglected, are these techniques, are these educational techniques that we've just taken and learned and kind of morphed them and used them in this way?
I hope not. I mean, there's an element of technique, right? There's some things you've got to learn how to do in a classroom, but most of the meaning making in classrooms is not at the technique level. It's a practice is something you do with other people over time. I think it's really quite important that a practice is not something as a teacher that I do to students. Right? A practice is something we do together. And so one of the things that's in the book that I've been writing about lately on this is I teach literature among other things, and I started getting concerned about the reading practices that we engaged in together. We're reading 20th century German literature. Some of it's written by Holocaust survivors. And what do we actually do with that? So your professor assigns you 50 pages by tomorrow. You need to read maybe 30 of them so as to not embarrass yourself in class the next day. You read those pages probably in an environment where you've also got the laptop open with the Facebook page and the cell phone by your side and the music going, and the coffee, you're down at the commons area. And you really speed up through the last 10 pages because it's 20 minutes before class. And then you get to class, and what I, as the teacher, do in class is I then start asking questions, and I reward the people who put their hands up and are quick to answer questions. So in other words, the more that you offer opinions about this text that you've barely read, the more you get rewarded as being a good student with participation grades and so on. So again, I'm actively socializing you into making snap judgments about things that you're not in a position to make good judgments about. And I'm rewarding you for that. There's research on how teachers ascribe intelligence to students, and it suggests that for mainstream Anglo teachers, speed of verbal response is one of those things. If you talk faster and answer questions quicker, you're smarter in the perception of teachers, which is really stupid when you start thinking about it, right? The person who thinks least before opening their mouth is the smartest person in the room. So again, I started realizing I'm embedded in a set of classroom practices that actually, if I stop and think about it, are not pushing me in the direction that I actually want to go in. And it's not because of the youth of today or Game Boys or whatever it is, right? This is my classroom. This is the way I reward behavior in my classroom. So I reconstructed my course around practices of slow reading, repeated reading, and so on, and we pursued that for a semester together. But part of what's interesting about that is, suppose I say to you, okay, we read this story for today, we discussed it for an hour, now I want you to read it again. Just reading it again, it might be beneficial, but it's just reading it again, right? Reading something twice is not a Christian practice yet. There's nowhere in the Bible that it says, thou shalt read things twice, right? And that this is pleasing to the Lord and will lead to salvation. But what happens if, again, it's like with the Sabbath thing, there's these dual tracks, right? If if we start reading things twice and we start talking together about things like charity, what does it mean to read a text charitably? Right? You pick up a text, it came from an author. Somebody wrote this. If you wrote it, how would you want to be read? What does it mean to do to others like you'd have them do to you when you read a text? How do you love your neighbor if your neighbor is an author? Right? How do you love your neighbor if your neighbor wrote your textbook? It's pretty hard. It might be love your enemies. Right? That's, but still, right, New Testament says you still got to love them, even if they're your enemies, right? Even if they wrote this really boring book that you wish you didn't have to read, you still got to love them. When we start talking about that, and what I found with talking about this in class is that many of my students, even senior students, are not used to using the vocabulary of charity, for instance, to describe what happens when you read a book. That's kind of a new connection. Or justice. What does it mean to do justice to a text? You want to love mercy, seek justice, walk humbly before God? What do justice and humility mean when you're reading a text? Right? What would you need to go through to do justice to a text, to be humble before a text? Right? Humility is you don't decide on page 3 that this is a really dumb book. So once we start using that language to describe what we're doing and going through a set of moves that might plausibly count as doing this, we start to build practice together. The next thing we find out is we can't do it. Right? And this part of the rhythm of Christian practices is that they undo you. They're not mastery things. They're not things where you figure out, if you start a serious prayer practice, the first thing you're going to learn is you don't know how to pray. They start to undo you, and you start to find out, I don't read texts charitably. I don't do justice to the people whose opinions I discuss and criticize before others, and so on. And you start having to do some soul searching. And then over time, over the semester, we start seeing whether we can catch a rhythm that starts leading us towards forming ourselves differently, that maybe we can start taming our inattentiveness. Maybe we can start together gathering around the text and trying to figure out what it really means. So again, that's not a technique. It's not like I can walk in week 3 and do something to you, and now you turn into charitable readers. And it's not even as if we talk about practices, this is going to automatically turn us all into charitable, just humble readers in some mechanistic kind of way. Again, it's about finding communal rhythms together that are pushing us in the directions we need to go in, that are inviting God to work among us. So.
How do I, as a faculty person, get past this idea? Because it seems to suggest mastery of the material. I mean, I want to be a master teacher. I want to master the material. I want my students to do the same thing. I find something very unsettling about the book, about the chapters. I've been teaching for 25 years, and all of a sudden I'm wondering, am I in the wrong, have I misunderstood God? Is this the wrong vocation? Do I know how to teach?
I mean, I don't know, the mastery thing's interesting. You don't want incompetence, right? I mean, you don't want to be taught by somebody who doesn't know anything about their discipline. But nobody's mastered their discipline. It's just dishonest. I mean, there's just way too much stuff out there. And nobody's mastered teaching, right? I mean, if you think you've mastered teaching, you don't get it, right? You work with people. They're different every time. There's a constant mystery to teaching. So there is a little bit of letting go of that ideal that you can control the whole thing, right? You're trying to find paths to fruitfulness, right? You're not trying to nail down all the variables. But there's also questions about what you model in that. So when I was teaching the literature course and thinking about charitable reading, just reading, and so on, I started thinking about how I walk into the classroom. And I can walk into the classroom different ways, right? I can walk in brisk and breezy, book in hand, right, and walk up to the board and say, right, we got to page 73 last time. Remember today you were supposed to read up to page 124? Hope you all got there. Yeah? Everybody get the reading done for today? Right, well today we're going to look at the role of how environmental concerns interacted with feminism in Germany in the 1960s. And we're going to look at how this comes up in this part of the novel. We're going to take a look at nature imagery, and this is where we're going to go today. So if you turn to page 84, could somebody start reading for me halfway through page 84? I'm modeling a certain relationship to the text there, and a relationship to knowledge. Or I could do what I decided to do that day when I started thinking about it. And I'm not saying you've got to do this every day, right? But I decided to walk into class with the text in hand, not make eye contact. You know, I've read this novel 4 times. I've taught it 3 times. And I was reading it again right before class. And I still can't for the life of me figure out, page 84 here, the top half of the page is talking about this, and then suddenly there's this switch, right? The topic seems to... Did any of you pick that up when you were reading this part? Because I'd still like some help on figuring out what's going on here. I mean, let's see if we can figure out what he's trying to do here. Again, I'm not saying one or the other of those is the right or the wrong way to walk into class, right? But they signal different things. They teach different things. They signal different relationships to text, different relationships to mastery, different relationships to humility, right? The first time what I'm enacting is, hey, I'm the professor, I've figured all of this out, I know exactly what this book means, I've got it all broken down into 30-page chunks, here's points 1, 2, and 3, if you write these down in your notes, you'll be good. And the second time what I'm modeling is, I've read this novel 4 times before, and in order to teach it, I still had to read it a 5th time, and there's still things in here that I'm wrestling with and that's why this novel is on a syllabus in a country that it wasn't written in, because it's profound enough that I can't get it in 4 readings. That's what makes this an important novel. And that part of how you wrestle with this is by wrestling with it, not by figuring you've got it right away and making notes. So, again, different days you might want to do different things for different reasons. I'm not trying to give models for every time, but those are the kind of questions I think we need to be asking.
I think increasingly I'm concerned about the practices that I use that actually are I know you have a conference at Calvin coming up in the fall on can we teach virtue, do we teach vices?
Right.
And I'm wondering what are some of these practices that you've seen that what is really being conveyed is a vice, and
right.
and then we do things to reinforce this vice.
Yeah. Well, a couple I've mentioned already, right? If my homework assigning practices essentially force you to skim read large chunks of culturally significant text, that's probably a vice, right? If we're reading Holocaust poets and you're skim reading them over coffee, that's not good. Another one is this whole kind of, making quick judgments about things before you fully understood them and airing your opinions in public. I think that's probably a vice. Another one that struck me very early on in my teaching career was I teach languages. And I trained to teach languages in an era when there was a very strong focus on transactional language functions. So your typical language textbook, and you still see some of this in beginning language textbooks, you would spend a lot of time learning how to buy things in cafes, how to buy train tickets, how to book vacations, how to talk about what you did at the weekend, and so on and so forth. And what I started to realize over time was I started to suspect that if you could record every utterance that any of us made in my classroom over a 12-month period, teacher and students, in German or French or whatever it was we were learning, that maybe 75% of those sentences would be first-person sentences. Because we spent an awful lot of time practicing how to say, this is what I did yesterday evening, this is what I'm going to do at the weekend, this is where I went on vacation last year, this is where I'm going to go next year, this is my favorite movie, this is my favorite book, these are the school subjects I would like the steak and fries, please give me a room for 2 nights, I would like a train ticket to Hamburg, right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We spent 3/4 of our time talking about ourselves and saying that we wanted things. Just think about that as spiritual formation. Right? What does it do to us if we spend all of our time talking about ourselves and what we want? Right? And I'm supposed to be a Christian teacher, for heaven's sake. Right? So again, I would describe my classroom at that time as structurally egocentric. Right? I say structurally egocentric because I'm not thinking primarily of the desires in people's hearts. I'm thinking about the structure of what we do together was entirely self-centered. The only reason we were learning German was so that we could get Germans to give us things. And so that we could tell Germans about ourselves, right? And I sometimes say to my students these days, you're not learning German so that you can bless more of the world with your opinion, right? It's, and again, I started to find it telling that we talk about learning to speak a foreign language, but we never talk about learning to hear a foreign language. We say to each other, do you speak German? We don't say, can you hear German? Right? Are you able to listen to Germans? So again, are there things in our practices together that are essentially structurally self-centered, right? And and are they being reinforced by the choices that I make in my classroom? Well, think of a composition class, right? How many of your compositions are about your own opinions or your own personality or your own life story and so on? Some of them should be, right? But if a general pattern emerges where when you put pen to paper you're writing about yourself, what does that do in terms of formation? And how much time is spent digging into other people's perspectives and listening to them carefully before being able to write and then having to write in a way that honestly captures their perspective and not just your voice. Would that give us better journalism if more people went through that more? So, yeah, I mean, I could go on spinning examples, but certainly I think, there's plenty of times where I've turned around in my classroom and thought, good heavens, I'm working for the enemy. This is, the structures of what I do seem to be pushing in a direction that once I can name it, isn't what I think I set out to do.
Does this book call for a blurring of the lines, distinctions? Should we keep lines that this is not the church, this is the academy, or is this a blurring or a call for the erasure of those lines?
Not erasure. I do think an academy is a different thing from a church. So I think there's some tricky issues around here that I don't think I've completely figured out yet. So I'm going to try and dance around this a little. But I think in a church context, there's more legitimacy to the notion that you might just be submitting to formation, right? You're just trying to learn a prayer practice or whatever it is. I do think in the academy, there should be a critical thinking component to it. You should be trying to figure out what's going on here and why. And it's not just a do this, it'll be good for you. I'm not even sure church should be totally like that, but maybe more so sometimes. But what I am finding in my own classroom as I experiment with this is that, for economy of time, take the example I already described around charitable reading practices, right? We start trying to engage in a different set of reading practices to the ones that are typical of many of the classes that both we as teachers and learners have experienced. That starts opening up questions. Why are we bad at this? What formed us to be bad at this? What cultural practices have led us to be the kinds of readers that we are? What does the author we're reading have to say about this? And so on. It starts to open up spaces for critical inquiry. It starts to cause us to reconceptualize things. So early on in the semester, there's a conversation often emerges with students where I say, can you love a book that you don't like? And the initial answer is often, no, I don't think so, because we tend to use that language to say, well, I love John Grisham, right? And it means you really like John Grisham. So if you love something, it means you like it, right? But then I say, so can you love a person that you don't like? Well, my students are Christians, so yes, they know you're supposed to love people that you don't like. Okay, so why are we using that word differently in these two different contexts? Why can't you love a book that you don't like? What would it mean to love agape, a book that you don't eros? So again, all kinds of spaces getting opened up for critical reflection, to actually turn and look back at our own practices, look at our own formation, look at the things that are making us the way we are, look at what we'd rather be and how we might get there. I think that's going to be more the focal point in an academic context, is we are trying to use this as a path to learning. It's becoming more learned. That's still the goal of the academy. Whereas in church, you might just be aiming to pray more. But that's not enough of a goal for my 20th century German lit class. I also want us to be getting a deeper understanding of how we function as readers of German literature and so on. So I've got a different set of goals in play.
We do want to open this up for questions. We have about 20 minutes left while some of you are looking over your question and getting up the courage to come to the microphone and ask it. One more question in connection with this is the academy. How do we assess this? What place the ever-present and I guess necessary role of assessment? I know that. But can we effectively, and how do we effectively assess this kind of formation, the formation of virtues, spiritual formation?
I think you need a multiple choice test that says, I have A, mastered this virtue completely, B, yeah, I mean, that's a tricky one. But also maybe an invitation to some creativity. I find myself, course by course, wrestling to come up with different ways of assessing. So I'm using the reading example just because I've already laid it out a little bit so we can make the connections rather than because it's the only one. But one of the things I do for assessment at the end of that course is I've chosen a poet that we read all semester. Every week in the semester we're reading a poem by this poet because I wanted to choose one author that we got to know really, really well. And so part of the final assessment for that course is go choose another poem from this poet that we've never discussed in class and show me how profound an interpreter of this poet you've become through 14 weeks of careful engagement. And that's part of the final assessment, right? And so So again, I'm looking for a form of final assessment that matches the competencies that we've been trying to build through the semester, right? Rather than one that suddenly turns it all into a game of remembering names and dates or something. So, or I teach a pedagogy course. I teach a course for people who are going to be language teachers. Again, part of what we're trying to learn in this course is how to be reflective Christian educators. So the final assessment is, I was tell students at the start of the semester, the final exam's cancelled, the final paper's cancelled, there's going to be no paper. And what we're going to do instead is the second half of the semester, you're going to work together to design teaching units that show that you've integrated concerns for the students' intellectual growth, moral growth, spiritual growth, cultural learning, language learning. And you're going to arrange a half-day conference for local area high school teachers, and you're going to present your teaching units to them, and you're going to put them on CD-ROM and give them out to schools to go try in schools. And I'm going to grade you on the quality of the conference and of your presentations. Because again, I think, you're trying to learn to be a teacher, and that means being able to teach people things. So I want to watch you teaching people things. So I need a form of assessment that isn't, like I don't think writing an essay about your philosophy of teaching predicts you being a good teacher. So I want a form of assessment that fits the kind of practices that we're trying to get good at. So yeah, I mean, that's an area of which we've got to get inventive at coming up with assessments that have some validity, right, where I can actually name the behaviors I'm looking for. So it's not just, yeah, I thought that was really cool, that gets you an A. But at the same time doesn't have to be a multiple choice exercise or something that goes right away from where we were trying to get to.
We have a question right here.
How do our educational practices inform our concepts of masculinity and femininity? And even more, like, how do they inform how we see and treat the outliers in those areas, those who don't fit in?
Yeah, that's one of the many variables that's at work in every classroom. So one of the things that often comes up when I talk about this with people, for instance, the little thing we just talked about mastery. Mm-hmm. One of the things that comes up at Calvin, and again, maybe different here, I don't know the campus culture, is I think there's pretty good evidence that it's the case that if you're a female faculty member, you have to perform mastery more aggressively to get respect from students, especially from male students, than if you're a male faculty member. That if you're a female faculty member, you're more likely to have to power dress, you're more likely to have to appear assertive, you're more likely to have to quote lots of things to prove that you've mastered your discipline, or else you're going to be perceived as less competent, less intellectual, etc., than your male colleagues, simply because you're female. And because the socialization of many of our male students is for those kinds of perceptions of female academics. So that's a factor in play in the classroom, and it means that as a male teacher, as compared to a female teacher, I've got different puzzles to solve. Right? And of course, like you say, that's just the male-female part of it, right? Once we start opening up the spectrum then as to what kinds of models are being offered of masculinity, femininity, even whether that's a simple dichotomy, all those things do come into play. Again, I think not only in the content of what I teach, but also in the practices we engage in together, how we name things, how we listen to each other, how we, what kinds of roles we portray in front of class. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
What if I buy into this and what if I begin to engage in these practices in my class, but it's not a larger systemic or cultural phenomenon, right, where these practices are reinforced in the other classes, in my discipline, in the general education, right, outside the classroom. Is there, again, right, I get maybe this idea of just learning a technique for this one place, and if it's not embedded in a larger culture.
Right. Yeah, I think the larger culture thing, for something to become so ingrained that it becomes your unquestioned reality and just the rhythm in which you do things, to some degree it has to be part of a larger culture. Those are the things that tend to become your unquestioned rhythms. But even within the confines of a single course that only meets a few times a week, that's enough to open up learning spaces where some of this stuff starts to get some traction and open up new questions and new possibilities for you. I've seen that with the reading course, where even though not all the other courses are doing that, we're just a 3-credit course 3 times a week, and by the end of the semester, students are starting to say, this is really making me question the way I'm learning for some of my other courses. In other words, it's starting to push back on the practices in other contexts. Or I had a student at the end of that semester journaling saying, The other day I was in the coffee shop where I work, and a homeless guy came in. And my first impulse was to get rid of him because he wasn't a customer. And, it's part of the practices of the coffee shop, right? And then I stopped and I thought about what we've been working on all semester about slowing down and not making judgments and reading charitably and so on. And I thought, how do I read this person charitably? And so I asked him what was going on and found out some things and gave him a sandwich, and it just turned into this whole other encounter. So again, I think even within this 3-credit German Lit course, you can create enough friction with the practices of the surrounding world that it starts to raise questions for you. It starts to create moments where you have to renegotiate. Bring this down to an even smaller context. I was teaching a course last year on Dietrich Bonhoeffer in German, and we read his book Life Together, which is all about Christian practices. And it just seemed wrong to read that book in a lecture, discuss, write essays format, because that's not what the book's about. So we decided we had to actually practice what he said to figure out whether it made any sense or not. If you don't do it, how do you know whether he was right? And early in the semester, one of the things he was talking about, Bonhoeffer was talking about in the book, was our tendency in Christian community to have ideals for each other. We've got ideals in our head as to what ideal Christian community should look like. Before very long, the rest of you fall short of my ideals. And then I become the accuser of the brethren because you fall short of my ideals and you're not giving me the beautiful Christian community, this purely Christian reality that I want to see. And so I start to judge you. Teachers do this to students all the time. And maybe students do it to teachers sometimes too. So we just fall short of each other's ideals, we judge each other, and we become accusers, is what he's talking about. So the practice we adopted for that week was very simple. And this was a 1-credit course. We only met on Mondays. And so we had a week in between class meetings. The practice we agreed to do was to choose a person that you ran into on a regular basis around campus. Had to be somebody in one of your classes or in your dorm that you saw several times during the week. And it had to be somebody you really didn't like, somebody you found irritating, you disagreed with their opinions and their personal habits, whatever it was, that it just wasn't a person you would choose to be in a room with. And the task was simply that every time you laid eyes on that person around the campus this week, you had to offer a prayer of thanks for them. And it had to be disciplined. You weren't allowed to interject your ideals into the prayer, which means you're not allowed to pray that they would turn into a different person, right? So you're not allowed to pray that anything changes in their life. You just have to offer a prayer of thanks, and you had to be disciplined about that. Now, at the end of that week, I'm reading student journals about this. I had a student write a whole section about this saying, this is really weird. I've been doing this for 1 week, and I don't dislike the guy anymore. I just find I can tolerate him now, right? Something shifted, and he doesn't annoy me anymore. And I'm just thinking, isn't that interesting? You do this really simple little practice that Bonhoeffer's talking about in here, and it reconfigures your relationship to some part of your world without the whole of the rest of the academy being reconstructed around you. Right? It's just took a 1-credit course once a week and a little practice a few times a week and so on. Now, the fact that this is small and local means it might not be permanent and life-changing, right? This probably wasn't enough to transform your relationship with every annoying person for the rest of your life, right? It's sort of, it was just this little local practice. But just going through that experience of trying a different practice and it opening up another possible response is enough to open up a thinking space of saying, oh my goodness, I don't even, disliking people, that's partly a choice. That's partly a practice. Maybe there's ways of choosing differently, and you can maybe start looking at more systemic practices. So I sometimes wonder, what if, right? Thankfulness, that's a Christian virtue, right? Gratitude. What would happen if as students, I'm sort of making this up as I go along, so you'd have to modify this in all kinds of ways, but what would happen if you decided that in a given course, maybe even a course that you didn't like that much as a student, that for the first 2 weeks of the course, every day as you walked across the threshold out of the door of the classroom, you remembered to thank God for the privilege of having an education. And for the next 2 weeks after that, you thanked God for this specific course. So you would do the easy things first, and then we gradually move to harder things, right? And then the next 2 weeks after that, you go up and thank the professor aloud for the course. And the next 2 weeks after that, you have to identify a specific other person in the class from whom you learned something from something they said today, and you thank God for that. And the next 2 weeks after that, you go thank the person for what you learned from what they said. What would that do to your relationship to that learning over a semester, over 3 months? I wonder. I don't know. I mean, maybe nothing, right? There's always the risk of practices, right? They're not technologies. They don't always work the same way. But maybe something quite profound. I don't know. I mean, you're not going to find out unless you try it, right? It's, practices are also things you have to do in rhythm over time. Again, that's not a practice we choose. Part of what made me think of that was teaching I taught high school for a few years before moving into the academy, and I remember having a kid in one of my classes who was an immigrant from another culture, just arrived, and in my class for the first, I want to say, 4 weeks of the semester, walked to the front of the class every day at the end of class and thanked me for the class. And then after about 4 weeks, she figured out this wasn't a practice in this culture, and she quit doing it. And a part of me thought it was kind of sad, right? I mean, it was inevitable, right? If you're 12 years old and nobody else does this, then you quit doing it, right? Not many 12-year-olds are brave enough to keep that up for a year if nobody else is doing it and everybody else thinks it's creeping up to the teacher, right? So, but I also thought this is not a bad practice, right? You just received something from someone, you go thank them for it. Why is that weird? So again, there are all kinds of things we don't do. There are absent practices that you could engage in. The whole of the society doesn't need reconstructing for you to start experimenting with things that you could change in your practice environment as a student, even without the teachers getting this, right? I think this is part of the reason I use the student example. I, as the teacher, have a calling to try to be a Christian teacher, and I'll fail at that in all kinds of ways. And my students have a calling to be a Christian student, and they'll fail in all kinds of ways. And we've got to figure out together how to practice Christian learning. And sometimes I carry the burden. I'm trying to teach Christianly, even though my students just didn't sleep enough last night and aren't really with the program. And sometimes as a student, you've got to take responsibility of being a Christian learner, even if your teacher's not providing you with the cues to get that done.
Since there are so many students here, I wanted to ask about what are some of the things, and you touched on this in your last answer, but what are some of the things that students can do practically to help make their courses more formative spiritually?
Yeah, we're actually, the project I've got going right now, we had a first meeting a month ago, is I've got a team of people together, faculty, student life people, some high school teachers and some students, and we're discussing that for a year. We're trying to read back through the tradition, back to the monastic literature, Augustine, medieval stuff, through to recent books on how to be a Christian student, and we're going to try to have a wide-ranging discussion about what's the calling of the Christian student, right? That if you're a student, you're not just preparing for a future calling. Right now, you're called to be a student. And so how do you be a Christian student? And my fear is that the popular literature on that focuses a little too much on 3 domains, which I would call loosely there's a moral domain, right? So, don't have sex, don't do drugs, don't party too much, don't vandalize the town, right? Avoid those things, right? Be polite to your professors, that kind of thing. Turn your papers in on time, right? Be a good kid, right? And I tend to speak a little flippantly about these things, but I'm not mocking that. I mean, that's good. Then there's kind of a devotional domain, right? Read your Bible, pray, go to chapel, evangelize your unsaved friends, right? That's another domain. There's an intellectual domain. So this sometimes seems to boil down to don't believe what your professors tell you about Marx, Freud, Darwin, or Derrida. So try to develop a Christian mind, right? Think critically about what, in the light of Scripture and so on, about what you're being taught. And those are all good and they're all valid, but we can continue adding domains. So chances are there's somebody in your class who's struggling with the learning and not getting it. Is that your problem? Or is that just the institution's problem or the professor's problem? Right? Is it Christian to be in a community, however temporary, and not care about the needs of the weakest member of that community? Right? So if you're in class and you're focused on your success and you're getting straight A's, does that free up any of your time for the person who's barely getting a C- and could maybe use an hour with you to go back over what we did today over coffee? Would that be a Christian practice that you can engage in as a student? Or is it somebody who just needs encouragement, somebody who just needs you to turn around and say, hey, did you get what you did today? Right? Or how did that go for you today? Or whatever, right? In other words, do we engage in community building practices as participants in classrooms in higher education? My guess is not enough. Do we ever sit down and think, what I learned this semester, how does it apply to the needs of my community? Is there any way I can take what I've learned and it makes me better at responding to the needs of my community? Is there anything I can do with this? Right? I can seek good through this. What about some of these things we've talked about? This author is my neighbor, so how do I treat the work of his or her hands? if they happen to be an author I disagree with, right? If I'm conservative and I'm reading a liberal or vice versa. What's a Christian way to read that? How do I... There's a strand back through spiritual disciplines in the Christian tradition about how do I form myself in attentiveness so that I'm not so wrapped up with all the things going on in my own head that I've got nothing left to pay attention to creation and to pay attention to other people. There's a guy that I research from the 17th century called Comenius, who wrote on education. And he bounced off Proverbs chapter 8, where Proverbs chapter 8 talks about God's wisdom at the dawn of creation, delighting in God's presence, delighting in humankind, and delighting in creation. There's a threefold delight in Proverbs. Go look at Proverbs 8, right? It's joy in God, joy in creation, and joy in human beings. That's what wisdom does, according to Proverbs 8. That's what Comenius says learning's all about, right? Is learning to rejoice in God, to rejoice in creation, and to rejoice in human beings. So if you've got enough space left that you can take joy in the people around you, the creation that you're studying, and God, or are you so wrapped up with all your busyness and your own agendas and so on and so forth that you can't pay attention, right? You don't have enough slow down in you that you can actually see what's there or actually hear what's going on with the people around you. What disciplines would you need to engage in as a Christian student to enhance your attentiveness potential, right? For people, for creation, for God. And yeah, we're going to talk about this for a year, so I'll have a longer list in a year's time, hopefully, but we can keep going. So I really think there's a conversation to be had about thinking more holistically about how you engage in self-formation with other people. I don't think you just try and do this on your own. I think you get together with other people and talk about this and start to try to create accountability and so on. I think there's a lot there to explore.
Let's make this our last question here, conscious of the hour.
Students, question time. But I did have a question I hope is relevant for the students here. A lot of the examples from the book and we've talked about are from higher education. And I was wondering, first of all, if you had examples from K to 12 because you've worked with educators in that situation,
yep.
To kind of inspire the future teachers in here, but also because K to 12 does a lot. Well, yeah, there's probably a lot more political aspects in terms of outside forces wanting to enforce certain practices
right.
in the classroom.
Right.
I mean,
right.
influencing, if not
right.
actually controlling certain practices in the classroom.
Right.
And what are your thoughts about Christian teachers working within a system where there is a lot of pressure for standardization, like standardized testing
right.
and things like
right.
that?
A couple of things there. Let me first just throw out a resource, because one of the things we put at the Kai's Institute, one of the things we put a lot of time into over the last couple of years is a new website that we just put up called whatiflearning.com. So just whatiflearning, or one word, .com. It's for K-12 teachers. The core of the site is 100 narrative examples of teachers connecting their faith to their pedagogy across the curriculum and across the age range. You can filter them by subject and filter them by age and so on. So there's 100 examples. And the strategy banks and resources around that and so on. It's quite an extensive resource. So that we built that to let me off the hook so that I can just go read the website. But seriously, I hope it's a helpful resource if you're going to be a teacher for starting to think through how faith might relate to the way you teach. The other thing I'll say about that resource is a very large proportion of the examples on that site would work in a public school or a Christian school. Because they're not primarily about talking about Jesus in class. They're about how Christian commitment shapes the way you go about teaching and learning. They're about what we've been talking about. They're about the practices you engage in. Now, in terms of the other question about standardization, the couple of things I would say about that. First is, I fear that most teachers overestimate the degree to which they're constrained by standardization. We tend to think we have to do it this way because the standards say we have to. In fact, if you stopped and pulled it apart, you might find there are other ways of meeting the standards. Some countries get closer to that. So I know in some Asian contexts, the standardization is much more rigid than, much more detailed, I should say, than it is in most Western countries. And so when I work with Korean teachers, for instance, there's more constraints on exactly which words you teach in the English language syllabus and that kind of thing than there are here. What often happens here is you've got general standards to reach, but there's some freedom in how you get there. And that then is your space for responsible freedom. Every teaching situation has constraints. Every single one. There's no such thing as a completely free teaching situation. You have to work in a certain physical space, you have to work with certain students, you've got time constraints, you've got energy constraints, you've got financial constraints, and so on. Those are your design parameters. That's your arena in which you get to figure out how to be responsible. So some of the examples I gave earlier about, the teaching people to be self-centered by teaching them languages, which is what I did for a few years for a living. I was teaching in a public high school when I was thinking about that. And so started trying to reconstruct my teaching practices around more attentiveness to each other, more narration about other people, more listening to people's stories, and so on. And I was doing that within a fairly constrictive, prescribed examination system that told me which words I had to teach. There was a list of 2,000 words I had to get through by a certain time, and so on. But I still had freedoms within that. So the syllabus told me I had to teach words for clothing. My students had to learn the words for shirt and tie and jacket and trousers and so on. And all of the textbooks that I had pretty much placed that in the chapter about shopping, because that was a convenient place to put it. You learn to buy clothes, right? And you learn how to ask the price of the jeans and this kind of thing. It kind of works. But you know what? Shopping is not the only function of clothing. Right? There are other possible contexts in which you could learn that. So what I started doing instead was, I remember designing a class where the stimulus for the class was a photograph of some students who lost their lives resisting the Nazi regime in Germany in the early 1940s, Christian students at Munich University who decided if they were against the Nazi regime, they had to do something, and they started writing pamphlets, and they eventually got caught, and they died. They were executed. And there are photos of them. So let's describe what they're wearing, and then describe what they look like, and talk about how old they are, and talk about how they're feeling in the photo, and why they might be feeling that way, and what's the story behind this photo, and what they were doing. And I'm still teaching words for clothing and words for personal appearance and so on. It's not like I quit teaching German and go to a Bible study to do this. In fact, I think that's one of the beauties of thinking about practices. It's not necessarily about whether I'm talking religious content. It might be, but not necessarily. It's about how I structure the teaching and learning. And even that simple move from most of my textbooks had little cartoon pictures of Germans in them. It's pretty hard to learn to love a cartoon. At least the quality of cartoon that gets into textbooks. So I just took a decision. I said, no, I want photos of real people, because part of what I wanted to learn in this class is to learn to love foreigners. It's part of what you do in foreign language classes, you learn to love foreigners. Right? But then I need photos of real foreigners with real stories, not stock photos of Georg who lives in Hamburg and has a hamster and doesn't exist, right? He's a stock photo or he's a cartoon. It's difficult to develop much of a relationship with Georg if he doesn't exist. So again, there's nothing about that transgresses against the constraints of either teaching in the high school or teaching in public education or teaching to an exam system. It's actually a question of a matter of questioning, do I have to do it exactly this way simply because I have to get to those outcomes? Or are there other pathways?
The book is Teaching and Christian Practices, Reshaping Faith and Learning, co-edited by David Smith and James Smith. If you've read it, read it again, slowly. And charitably. If you haven't, I certainly commend it to you. Would you please join me in thanking our guest, Dr. David Smith.